Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. Today, bringing you another really fascinating guest involved in creating a better tomorrow. Today, we have the honor of being joined on the show by Dr. Erica Goldman, who is a director of the Day One program and director of policy entrepreneurship at the Federation of American Scientists. This is an organization that was formed at the end of World War II, made up of scientists across a diverse range of disciplines to join together, advance science policy, counter scientific misinformation, and ultimately work to minimize risks of various global threats, including things like nuclear war, biological and chemical agents, climate change. And the organization works ultimately to advance progress on a broad range of these issues where science, technology, and innovation policy can ultimately deliver progress. Dr. Goldman has served in various roles, so spanning the boundaries between science and policy throughout her career. She has a really diverse background that includes science writing, science policy, and academic research, and ultimately her passions lie in making connections between these different domains. Recently, Dr. Goldman served as the Deputy Director of the Global Council for Science and the Environment. There, she worked across a network of institutions and diverse groups of scientists, ultimately to improve scientific basis of environmental decision-making. Previous to that, Director of Policy Engagement for Compass, which is a nonprofit organization helping environmental scientists effectively share their knowledge in the public discourse and decision-making. She also served as a term in the White House Council on Environmental Quality on the Land and Water Ecosystems team during the Obama administration. Ph.D. in biology from University of Washington, undergraduate degree from Yale University. A lot of really cool themes to get into today. Honored to have her with us. Dr. Erica Goldman, thank you so much for taking time to go on the show.
Thank you so much, Ira. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great having you. I'm excited about the range of topics we're going to be going into, and especially this theme of policy entrepreneurship, which you have not yet covered on the show. So really happy to have you today, Erica. Would love to start off as we typically do for handing you the floor for a couple of minutes just to further introduce yourself. I always enjoy going into the literature that's been published by our guest, and I especially enjoyed taking a look at your Ph.D. which was entitled "Nonlinear Material Properties That Shape Locomotor Performance in Hydrozoan Jellyfish." And I got to tell you, I love jellyfish. I love everything they have to do in teaching us about development and regeneration and biomimicry. Would love to hear about a little more of your background and how you chose this particular topic for your dissertation.
Thanks so much, Ira. I really welcome the opportunity to kind of go that far back, and I suspect we'll kind of draw a through line today. But I'm sure many of you are wondering why jellyfish and how jellyfish got all the way to policy entrepreneurship. So my hope is that by the end of our conversation, we managed to connect some of those dots, although you might find them to be rather nonlinear. So I guess going back to jellyfish, I think I'll start just as I as a student in high school, like many, had dreams and ambitions of becoming a marine biologist growing up. I'll caveat that by saying I actually grew up in New York City, so in Manhattan, so not a whole lot of jellyfish and not a whole lot of marine biology, but spent a lot of time in my summers during high school and college, getting out in the field, seeing the natural world, experiencing different aspects of it. Spent time in high school spent 2 summers on an island off the coast of Maine, actually studying sea stars. So already a predilection for the invertebrates. Got to know
Mhm.
them pretty well. Came back my senior year of high school. Convinced my senior advisor to do an intercollegiate year project working at the New York Aquarium. So spent 3 afternoons a week trekking by the F train out to Coney Island to try to study marine biology within the confines of New York City. Carried that passion to explore kind of the natural world and particularly the marine environment into undergrad and eventually into graduate school, looking for opportunities to, I think, diversify that understanding of the natural world. So during college, had opportunities to spend time in Alaska as a field assistant, researching the mating behavior of the three-spined stickleback fish. And
Nice.
one of my formative memories and opportunities was to spend hours in a dry suit in icy lakes, taking notes on stickleback behavior, and also in that vein cultivated an interest in extreme environments, and so had an
Mm.
opportunity um, mixed in there to study at Lake Baikal in Siberia, and I can come back to that a little bit later. But you asked about jellyfish, and so I think that the momentum around my interest in marine science carried me through a lot of diverse experiences in college and into graduate school. And as I was looking at graduate programs and the opportunity to kind of deepen my interest, what really kind of drove my passion was trying to understand the connections between evolutionary biology, form, and function.
Yeah.
And ended up in grad school at the University of Washington. I had an opportunity to um, span the knowledge, span the two different graduate advisors, one that focused more on the evolutionary biology side of things, and then one biomechanicist, Tom Daniel, who really piqued my interest in jellyfish, and as kind of a model for studying this deep connection between form and function. And so that was the inspiration of why jellyfish. And when my family would ask me, like, why are you studying jellyfish? What does it have to do with the world while I was in grad school? My answer would be, well, if you look at a jellyfish, it's really sort of like an upside down heart, but it's like way simpler. If you look
Hmm.
at a jellyfish and its ability to propel fluid, and then you turn the jellyfish upside down, think about it in multiple directions with crazy different, musculature. The
Yeah.
fluid dynamics become way more complicated. And so for me, as I kind of pursued this interest in grad school, it became a simple and elegant opportunity to, like, in its most basic form, understand how what you're made of affects what you are and what you do. And so getting into, like, well, what does that have to do with nonlinear dynamics? At its core, I was asking the very simple question of how does being made of jelly affect the way that you move and do what you do? And what was fascinating about this work is you take one of the most simplest organisms out there, and the major finding was that just the nonlinear passive properties of that material that it's made of had all sorts of unexpected accelerating effects to how it moves. So, like, without having complicated nervous system, without having complicated muscles, just the nonlinear passive properties of being made of the gelatinous substance that jellyfish are made of affected its ability to move through water. So that was a long answer, but I think it's part of why it fascinated me. Yeah.
Yeah, no, again, I was getting that same when I was going through it, and looking at how you connected the musculature and the nervous system, or the ancient nervous system of the jellyfish with these mechanics, these shear stresses and fluid dynamics. Yeah, it was not, it wasn't just cool, but again, it came back to sort of this principle of sort of convergence that we've been getting into a lot on the show, and a lot of these disciplines, in this case, merging together biology, physics, and coming up with these interesting insights. So again, I appreciate you taking us through that, and I just thought it was a very interesting place to start. as you mentioned, you spent a lot of time in extreme environments, everything from Lake Baikal, and here we have the deepest lake in the world. You spent time in submersibles in the Pacific Ocean, in Antarctica for a little bit. And I neglected to mention also at the beginning of the show in your bio that one of the first jobs that you had, sort of coming out of your PhD, was as a news intern at Science Magazine, and here again, quite a convergent set of topics, discussing not just Baikal, but the interesting origins of species that you found at the depths of the lake. You went into papers on permafrost, and then also touched on things like how a cell works, and issues with NIH grants. And talk a little bit. We'll be getting into this theme of the importance of storytelling in a little bit, but I think this was sort of your first foray after your PhD in telling important stories, the things you're finding out. Say a few words about that, your experience as a news intern, and then just as a side question to that, any cool stories that some of this stuff in terms of the way you were describing what you were finding at the bottom of the lake, and this crucible of evolution, these amphipods. I had to look that up and see what they were. But anything you haven't talked about that may be surprising that you can tell us about, please? Any scoops?
Thank you for that question. I think where I would start with it, though, is trying to kind of draw a line from how I got from grad school to Science Magazine, because I think it encapsulates a little bit of the why. So I think as I progressed in my research, I realized a lot. Well, I realized a lot of things, but I think being heads down, focused on scientific discovery, for me wasn't going to be the area where I felt like I could have the biggest impact in the world. And it was when I kind of picked my head up and tried to connect what I was observing and seeing in the natural world to a broader impact, that I started to sort of see kind of where I might fit. And so, even starting to make the connection between things like having the opportunity to study as a graduate student in Antarctica, and then realizing that the reason I was able to do that is that the National Science Foundation funded a program that sent scientists from all over the world to Antarctica. And without the federal government, without Congress, without the National Science Foundation, we wouldn't have that. And as a young graduate student, I didn't understand any of that, but I was starting to. And I think what that really led me to do is to think about, like, it was late in my graduate career when I realized that I didn't want to do a traditional academic postdoc, but I was going to need to sort of take ownership and agency to figure out what a non-traditional postdoc might look like that would give me an opportunity to explore the power of science communication and its connection to policy. And so as I was completing my dissertation, I, at the encouragement of a mentor, Deborah Illman at the University of Washington, went to my very first AAAS meeting as a young graduate student, went to kind of a science writing internship fair, and started to try to get out there and tell my story about, like, hey, I know I have actually no science writing skills yet, but here's what I bring to the equation. And, I've taken some science writing courses while a PhD student, had the opportunity to meet one of the editors at Science Magazine who was there at the internship fair. And I was like, look, and really just went all in and was like, I don't know how to do this yet, but I see so much value in trying to become a scientist who also learns how to write and report and can then make the important connections to policy. And so it was the opportunity to land that internship. And then at the same time, subsequent to that internship, I spent a year as a science policy fellow on Capitol Hill. It was those two experiences combined that I think really helped crystallize how I could start to have an impact at the intersection of these different disciplines. And I would say during my time in science was very lucky to work with fantastic editors who really pushed me to not only improve my own writing and ability to do interviews and capture information, but also to start to draw the connections of how the science and the science enterprise connects to this broader world and how it works, and start to really learn a lot about that from there. So during that time, was able to write quite a number of, as you mentioned, write on really disparate topics.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing that, I think really, some of it came easier to others than others, like, the opportunity to write, to interview other scientists on, cool natural history type stories. I wrote a lot of short pieces, but it was but you mentioned, and this goes back, so forgive me, it goes back more than 20 years. So it's a long time now, but I do remember that piece on NIH budgets and writing it, and how much that in particular, really challenged me to kind of put together some of what I was learning about science as an enterprise and funding and all of those dynamics into the context of storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
So very much a
Mm-hmm.
work in progress from grad school to there.
Excellent.
What else?
Excellent.
What did I miss? I think there were a few other points.
Have you found any weird species that we, or a giant eel, and anything odd at the bottom of Lake Baikal? Maybe you didn't, but that's cool.
Well, I will say I did have an opportunity. So um, this was around the same time, not for Science Magazine, but was really intrigued about trying to tell a story about two different lakes, and
Okay.
pitched an article to a magazine that no longer exists. It was a publication of the New York Academy of Sciences called The Sciences, and ended up writing a feature story that was the tale of two lakes, and it compared Lake Baikal in Siberia to Lake Vostok in Antarctica, and it was like
Okay.
right around the time. So I was like, it was a combination of these are two places that I strangely care deeply about and have spent some time in, and from a storytelling perspective, there's a nexus between the two of them. On one hand, Lake Baikal, oldest and deepest lake in the world, full of crazy species that no one has really seen or understood. Lake Vostok in Antarctica, a lake locked under, many dozens of feet of ice that there was drilling to kind of penetrate it and start to sample it, and a race to get into the lake and at the same time not contaminate it while drilling. So it was like part of a kind of an ongoing evolution. So yeah, so lots of cool stuff there.
Excellent. Really cool. Really cool. Um, so as mentioned in bio, you eventually become the director of policy engagement for Compass, which it does all sorts of interesting work in terms of, as mentioning, helping environmental scientists share their knowledge, and again, sort of make this connection between public discourse, decision making. And you wrote a couple really interesting papers at that time, and I'd just like to talk a little about them because they sort of build on this importance of becoming a good storyteller. One of them was May 2013 in Conservation Biology, entitled "How Good Science and Stories Can Go Hand in Hand." Talking about if you're going to tell stories and you have a short amount of time to talk to somebody on the hill or whatever the case may be, it's got to resonate. It's got to have data, but not too much data, and it's also got to illuminate the future and options that that something cool is going to result from this. Talk a little bit about this, if you would. I think it's important.
Sure. I think, you raised convergence as a theme early, in your introduction. I think this is another example of where kind of interests and experiences converge. So I spent some time developing a craft around storytelling. After being a news intern in science, I spent almost 8 years as a science writer for the Maryland Sea Grant program, and really learned more about narrative storytelling. And then when I joined Compass, I became in a position where I was really supporting scientists to be effective at reaching their audiences. And for me, it was mostly bringing scientists into the policy dialogue. And what I had learned as a scientist myself, and then as a scientist trying to become a writer, was really the importance of the craft of storytelling was never going to never going to be wasted. And so the ability to, whether it's going out to a community to make a connection because you want to go sample in off the rocky coastline within a community, being able to articulate in non-jargony terms what you're not just what you're doing, but like make a human connection through a story about why that matters is an incredibly important point of connection. And that I think has extended to every dimension of policy engagement that I've encountered through my career, that your ability to not just show things concisely in terms of like, sure, maps and visualizations and data are great, but if you can contextualize that in a narrative that makes the connection between what you know to be true through rigorous science and a scientific process and how it connects to what other people care about is at the core, is the core of how I think about boundary spanning between science and policy as really an exercise in developing cross-cultural competencies. And if you think about what it is that what's universal to across all cultures is storytelling. I mean, every culture has a different approach, but it is, I think, a currency that just draws everyone together no matter what. And so, I think that's an area that there's enormous convergence. And so I think just in the context of that paper, that was an opportunity. My colleagues at Compass and a colleague at the University of Maine, we had the opportunity to be working with a group of marine conservation scientists who came together to really hone their own views of how stories connect people, but stories themselves can be data, and stories can be used in a policy environment. And so that was some convergence around those roles.
And building off that, it just, because a couple of years later, in prestigious National Academy of Sciences in 2015 of June, you write this paper on nature as capital, talking about ecosystem services and again, the federal policies and programs and related to this. And I just wanted to bring this up because it's very interesting, but at the same time, just a couple of weeks ago, I was joined by Marcia McNutt on the show, speaking specifically about, and sort of this is like the ultimate convergent thing, ecosystem services, right? I mean, it's the entire planetary sort of life support system put in a little box. And I would love just, again, a couple of minutes of your experiences here. Again, one of the conclusions here was that, hey, we need to develop a really new generation of tools here to advance policymaking in this area that sort of connects everything. I mean, it's the ultimate convergent system, right? Love to, get your insight for a couple minutes on what you learned at that particular time.
Yeah, I would love to talk about that, not just from the context of the paper, but all the stuff around the context of why I ended up working on that paper that you
Please.
wouldn't see. So through my work at Compass, we had been working over a period of a couple years to identify who are the scholars in the science field who were studying the valuation of ecosystem services. So like there's a whole groups of scientists out there who study different dimensions of like, okay, we know nature has value. How do we start to account for that value? How do you do it in a way that's not purely monetary? How do you then encapsulate that value and then use it in decision making? So I had been involved for about a year, identifying who those scientists were, coaching them, and then bringing them into policy dialogue with both the Hill and with folks in the White House, both in the Office of Management and Budget, Council on Environmental Quality, White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So had organized over a series of couple months, a series of briefings with groups of scientists, bringing them into those conversations. This was right around the time it was there. I think it was just post Hurricane Sandy, when some of this connecting of scientists' work was going on. And it became very clear in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy in 2012 and the dramatic impacts, especially in cities, that this was all of a sudden a really important open policy window for changing the conversation around nature as capital. And this, the idea that, had we had different wetland infrastructure around New York City, that we would not have seen the subways flood the way that they did and the dramatic impacts in downtown Manhattan, I think provided an opening to start to talk about ecosystem services and natural capital in a different way. And it was because of the work that I'd been doing at the time to connect scientists to the conversation, particularly within the White House, that I got I was basically asked, could you see a scenario where Compass would loan you for a period of time to go work on this issue,
Mm-hmm.
ecosystem services, in the White House Council on Environmental Quality? And it was right at the same time that I joined the co-authors on that paper, Mark Schaefer and Jane Lemchenko and others, writing that paper for Proceedings of National Academies. Was just at the same time that I was in negotiations with Compass and folks at the White House Council on Environmental Quality to figure out, could I do this? Could I go take do a tour of service on leave? Because of this policy window, they recognize an opportunity to drive forward federal guidance on saying
Mm-hmm.
not only should we be accounting for ecosystem services and federal decision making, all agencies should be considering federal ecosystem services and federal decision making. And we think the time is now to start to develop the guidance to do that. And so I had the opportunity to come in and serve for a period of, I think, about 6 months, and did some of that foundational work to lay on that guidance on ecosystem services. And I was the first of a long series of people that came after me that continued all the way through the end of the Obama administration, was a bit on hiatus in the beginning of the Trump administration, but then a group that came in, another group of colleagues, some of the same people who I had been working with back in 2012 on connecting scientists to decision making
Mm-hmm.
around this initially, we're now being asked to serve in the Biden administration to finish this. And so
Mm-hmm.
the amount of there was a tremendous amount of progress within within kind of the highest levels of federal decision making to go from let's talk about ecosystem services and federal decision making to seeing some guidance to federal agencies, all the way to, in the Biden administration, finalizing guidance that starts to incorporate ecosystem services in all regulatory decision making through what's circular A4, which is wonky, but it's like the guidance for regulatory decision making, as well as momentum around creating ecosystem services accounts for how you value
Mm-hmm.
nature in statistical, like in accounts, just the same way that we talk about national classifications of jobs,
Okay.
including ecosystem services in those classifications. And so what was so exciting about all of this is that it shows, I mean, to me, it's a couple of things. It's like policy change can be very, very incremental. It can
Yep.
be driven by connecting the right people at the right time in the right context. And then all of a sudden, a policy window can open and things can move really fast. And in this moment, that first moment was Hurricane Sandy, and it provided kind of the first opportunity and momentum around, like, okay, let's bring people, expertise, and convening and all those things together at the right moment to help drive change. And I think we'll get to that, but I think that's a through line in my current role in terms of how I very much view that as, I don't think I had the language to think about it in this way and at this time, but that to me was very much like, what does policy entrepreneurship in action look like? It looks
Yep.
like giving people ideas, being nimble, being able to take advantage of policy windows, being tenacious. In this case, like, there was a tip of an iceberg, and it was a string of many, 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 many dedicated people who've worked on this for a long series of years to drive significant progress. And now it's, leaving aside where that particular body of guidance may land in the current administration, even by looking back, I was silently celebrating in 2024 when we saw the revised guidance, that goes all the way back to what we started working on back in like 2014. It was 10 years in the making, but it was like it was very cumulative, and it was very, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I could go on about this, but I think that was more than the answer to your question. But I think
Yep.
that paper was just that was just like one of the artifacts around that time, but the story around it was like how to
Yep.
connect people and ideas to
Yep.
opportunity.
Yep. Yeah, that's why that's why I wanted to talk about it. And again, it's an outstanding piece of work, and at the same time, yeah, it connects into obviously everything you're doing now. Um, and again, before we, as I mentioned in the beginning, you wear two hats currently in terms of director of policy entrepreneurship and the director of the day one program, which we'll be getting into. But before we get there, could you take a couple of minutes and just talk a little bit about the Federation of American Scientists? I mentioned, in the bio, founded, just a couple of months after the end of World War II. A bunch of scientists and engineers from the Manhattan Project for sort of the folks initially involved, and it had obviously this initial connection with nuclear events at the time. Take us a little bit into the history and a little bit of the evolution of the organization, and then we'll talk a little more about policy entrepreneurship.
Sure. You captured a lot of the highlights in your intro. But I think what I would say is really drawing a through line around FAS as an organization that is founded and driven by policy entrepreneurship from its earliest days. So, going back to the aftermath of the Manhattan Project, it was really a group of entrepreneurial scientists that came together to think about how to ensure that we're holding government accountable and shedding light and transparency on what was going on with the development of our nuclear capacity. And that body of work and our nuclear information program and our global risk program have remained steady and strong throughout FAS's history. Going back 3 to 4 years now, so we've as an organization really significantly broadened and scoped and transformed quite a bit in a short amount of time. We had the opportunity to kind of take the historic version of FAS that is more familiar to, I think, most folks, that's really focused in the nuclear and national security space, and merge it with, at the time, the Day One project was a nascent effort led by our current CEO, Daniel Correa. And the Day One project as an initiative started out as an initiative within FAS. And in a pretty quick period of time, those two entities merged. So the Day One project became fully embedded within FAS's umbrella. And it provided us with the opportunity and a moment in time to think about how to merge the tactical approaches of the Day One program, which we can get into, this idea that good ideas can come from anywhere, that crowdsourcing expert input into policy can generate robust and actionable solutions, and deploy it not just in a way that we're bringing more ideas into the ecosystem, but against different topical domains. And so that kind of merging of the Day One approach with FAS as it's always been provided a moment that we could expand into different domain areas. And so from the period, just over the past 3 years, we rapidly were able to apply the tools of policy entrepreneurship to grow things like our wildfire portfolio, which I can come back to at the end, to grow a footprint focused on extreme heat policy, the bioeconomy, meta science, clean energy. So we're basically taking the tools and approaches of thinking about how to bring in diverse expertise and now piloting its application across different domains. And so that I think has happened rather rapidly over the past several years. The other opportunity that sort of came to fruition right around this kind of merger of the Day One program and his FAS was the establishment of the FAS Talent Hub. So we stood up a program to place senior and mid-career experts in government, and it was rapidly responsive to a need that wasn't being met elsewhere, kind of in the science policy fellowship ecosystem, in that it was very much driven by policymaker as customer. What are the decision makers in government needing that they don't have? And our fellows became very much like where we would evaluate whether there was a case to place a fellow would be what we would call the but for impact. But for a person in this role doing this thing, driving at this thing, progress will not be made, and started to rapidly identify lots of places within government where they were clearly on a track to deliver in a high impact role, but were missing critical capacity. And so as part of the tools of policy entrepreneurship, talent and how to leverage talent both in developing new ideas through the crowdsourced policy development, which I can talk more about, but also as directly serving in government, similar to the way I had done back in 2014, being able to do that repeatedly in ways to add that but for capacity on particular areas was another way in which FAS has changed and grown in that period of time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's drill down on some of this because it's interesting. I in reading several of your pieces on policy entrepreneurship over the last couple of years, I was able to sort of put together a very interesting basket of what policy entrepreneurs, well, what they are and what they're not. I mean, some of the things I learned included the fact that the policy entrepreneurs are kind of unknown. Defining their position, even amongst experts, is kind of difficult. The process of becoming one and the details of the qualifications are kind of vague. They fly under the radar a lot, and their work is rarely found in science and policy curriculums in academia. That all being said, all right, that's a doctor, there's the lawyer, there's the pharmacist. What is describe a policy entrepreneur from FAS's perspective? I mean, what is the what does the policy entrepreneur look like? What are the qualifications for this position?
What's the
We'll talk.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this question. And I will say, to add to it, I think part of my hopes and dreams of what we accomplish at FAS is bringing policy entrepreneurship out of the shadows as something that's slippery and hard to define and murky, and not just to create common definitions, but to actually figure out how do we grow a movement and a field and train a next generation of policy entrepreneurs. Because I think many of the policy entrepreneurs I think I used this phrase in the article that you're referencing, policy entrepreneurs in the wild are, when it's like spotting them on safari, right? It's not exactly, you can't go to a specific place and say, like, this is where they all are. They're in very different roles inside and outside of government. And I think what your question is like, well, so how do you identify them? What are the characteristics? What I think about it is there are tenacious individuals who are incredibly determined to make change in the world, who have the flexibility on how they make that change. So their ability to kind of read the policy tea leaves and understand, like, this may not be the right moment to have this set of conversations, but if I can shift how I'm thinking about it, I can pursue it a different way. And so I often describe it as, in the policy literature, you often talk about policy windows. I think about policy entrepreneurs as walking around the house, looking at the window. If the window is closed, trying to go around to the basement stairs and figure out if they can go in through the basement or tunnel in through the chimney, but being entrepreneurial about what it is that they need to do to figure out how to make impact. And I think that still sounds, I think, vague and unsatisfying, because it's like, well, how do you teach people to go do that? And so I think that's part of what we're working on through the Day One program, is through building a platform for policy entrepreneurs. We are bringing in people with ideas, giving them the skills and framework to write those ideas down in a way that policymakers can access and use. But beyond that, and this is where we are right now, I think you have seen we've just kind of completed a pretty large scale initiative around Day One 2025, crowdsourcing a lot of new ideas for this next administration. Now we're in the implementation adoption phase, trying to support as many of these new policy entrepreneurs. So they've just written down their idea for the first time, supporting them to figure out what do they need to do to kind of find their basement stair entry for their idea.
Hmm.
And, it is our belief that we can grow and scale this approach in a way that's replicable. But I think this is still very much from my perspective, a field and a movement that's in development, where there are a number of kind of seasoned policy entrepreneurs. Many of them have gotten there through their life experience, but
Uh-huh.
wouldn't have necessarily gotten there by saying, I want to, going through the prescribed, I want to be a policy entrepreneur when I grow up curriculum. They've gotten there through their life experience,
Right.
and now are in a position to, I think, mentor a next generation. And also, we know more about what are these characteristics, um, to help then translate them to replicable skills and abilities.
Hmm.
And so I think that's a little bit about what I wrote about in that article, but I think that is my belief, is that um, we want to see less of just policy entrepreneurs in the wild, and a movement of policy entrepreneurs who have the skills, knowledge, and ability to go to go deploy that in driving
Hmm.
impact.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I think it's worth, I just want to add one thing, which is I think it's worth differentiating. So I think about this a lot because, I started in academic science, I've worked in science communication, I've worked in science policy boundary spanning, connecting scientists to decision making. And I think about kind of the science policy boundary as a continuum. And these are all of these roles are along this continuum. When I think about policy entrepreneurship, it is um, as adjacent to policy itself as you can be without directly being in a government role. And so it's like it's all the way at the end of the continuum without being fully inside. And I think that is even among the other groups within the science policy world, that's still kind of a difference in approach, because different from kind of advocacy where you're kind of coalescing a group around a single position, policy on entrepreneurship may look very, very different in from topic to topic, from person to person, from idea to idea, but
Hmm.
they're all unified by the idea that um, ideas can be made actionable, and if you
Yep.
understand what to do with them, you can drive impact. But
Hmm.
that's different than it is way more nuanced and case by case than I think a lot of other work in the science policy space.
Right. In the winter 2024 piece, the bring on the policy entrepreneurs and issues of science and technology. One of the cases that you highlight, and I think this is a great example, is this Dr. Julian Elliott. And basically in that case, and I guess this translates to a lot. I come out of the biopharma space. In his case, it was specifically HIV, and in the paper, making a point that look, between publishing research and then meta-analyses and the systemic reviews of multiple papers and so forth and so on, it can be years in biomedicine before there's an aha moment, and then that leads to new guidelines and so forth. In this particular case, I mean, it was all about, he didn't plan, this wasn't a career choice at first, but a way to ultimately synthesize that data a lot faster, and ultimately create these insights not in years but in days, that they could be available for other researchers, clinicians, and ultimately policymakers. Say a few words about Dr. Julian Elliott, if you would.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Dr. Elliott's work on living evidence and the potential impact of living evidence to bring up to date information to decision makers on a cadence that they can use
Mm-hmm.
um, is enormously appealing to me from a kind of perspective of evidence-based policy. I got to know Julian. I reached out to him. So he had published a paper in Nature back in 2021, like a Nature comment piece, basically kind of framing the living evidence paradigm and sharing a little bit about why it had been so amazingly high impact during the pandemic in Australia, because it provided an opportunity to bring stakeholders together to agree around single sources of, like, what are we going to agree that is new evidence that needs to be incorporated into guidelines for COVID on a weekly basis. And it pushed the envelope on all of the different kind of methods and approaches for developing guidelines that are pretty
Yep.
static and couldn't afford to be static during COVID. And, I got to know Julian a couple of years ago, and over the past several years, we've worked very closely with him and his organization, the Future Evidence Foundation, to help bring the living evidence paradigm to U.S. government. And so we actually, this is separate right now. I've helped lead a whole body of work that's looking at living evidence approaches and bringing the U.S. federal agencies to try to kind of bring some knowledge and appetite around that, similar to Australia. But Julian, as an individual, I think, when I approached him for this story to say, hey, I want to talk about you as a policy entrepreneur. Like, yes, you're studying living evidence, but like what I've seen you do, you are like you are the archetype of the kind of person that I think fits this model. And he didn't, as we talked about it, he saw what I was saying, but I don't think he self-identified it yet as one of those amazing policy entrepreneurs in the wild, though he clearly was one. And so I think, just going back to his story, where his story started in terms of the impact of being a policy entrepreneur really gained focus during COVID. He had been working on this paradigm since 2014. He'd been publishing, writing, trying to do some proof points and test cases, and it was this just a clear example of somebody motivated by, we need to do something different, passion around that idea, then brought to a moment where like this is the window of opportunity, and it has exploded. And since the time, not only is there huge traction for living evidence from his work in Australia, the WHO now has picked it up as their model for like all guidelines going forward. The Wellcome Trust and the UK government have just announced a huge initiative that's catalyzing a global movement around living evidence. And so even just over the past 2 years, the inflection point of what's happened from kind of a single individual just kind of chipping away at something that he was passionate about to being a catalyst for a global movement, to me is absolutely the essence of being a policy entrepreneur, whether or not he would call himself that or not. And so, over the past 2 years, I've been incredibly grateful to get to not just know him and work with him on living evidence, which has been enormously productive in the US context, but also just because I see so much of these policy entrepreneurial qualities that, we're seeking to grow a field of people like that who can bring that kind of passion, tenacity, talent, and humility all in one package. I think is just incredible. So that's what I'll say about Julian.
Yeah, no, it's again. I thought it was a great case, especially
Yeah,
because I'm from the life sciences space and the biopharma industry, and again, it was a really nice example. And again, thinking about how we can shrink the time on ultimately creating knowledge and policy that flows from that. So I thought it was an elegant example. Now, ultimately, the goal, as you're mentioning, in bringing folks in from the wild is, we want to try to create lots of Dr. Julian Elliott's across all disciplines, and this is sort of the crux of the day one project, and ultimately crowdsourcing these potential science policy innovations, get more people interested in this component of what's going on. Talk about the day one project. Talk a little bit about the model. I know there's open calls and memos and a lot that happens here, but ultimately the goal is to bring together hundreds, if not thousands of contributors, ideas across the science and technology spectrum. But take a little time and talk about this. I think it's kind of an important program.
sure, absolutely. I'm happy to. And I want to while I'm working and leading the program now, I want to give all the credit to Daniel Correa, our CEO, and I think who was really the founder of the Day One project and its origins in 2019. I think the idea was pretty simple. It's as it started, it was, can we meet the moment of the 2020 election by trying to crowdsource 100 actionable memos for that moment of transition? And that was basically when the project launched, it was with that goal. I was actually at the time, that's how I got to know FAS and the Day One Project. So I was a memo author myself in that original call, but not yet. And I wrote a memo on evidence-based policymaking. So I was part of it as a participant of the Day One Project in its
Mm-hmm.
initial days, and just was just captivated by the power that it had. And so, originally founded with this idea of crowdsourcing just 100 ideas. From that, we've adapted the approach to, we've done big pushes around presidential elections, so in 2020 and in 2025. But our steady state with the Day One Project is incorporating those tools and approaches in all of our program areas. So we run accelerators, we run policy sprints, we have a standing open call. These are all different, just slight variants on the same approach for getting good ideas from experts into formats that they can use. And so just to differentiate kind of a few of them, the accelerator model is an approach where we recognize that we want to build the capacity in a big community where there's a dearth of ideas. We think the field needs to be more active in getting ideas that can be actionable, but we don't have a particular policy moment or window in mind. It's more field building is, I think, when we would use an accelerator. The policy sprint, and I can speak a little bit about wildfire in that context.
Sure.
We've adapted the Day One model really to look at where we see an opening policy window, and we recognize, like, we know something's going to happen where experts need to be at the table and ideas need to be at the table, but unless we work with them, they're not going to be there. That's when we would use the Day One approach in kind of a sprint model. And so an example of that would be, back in 2022, the Wildfire Management and Mitigation Commission, which was authorized by Congress in the bipartisan infrastructure law, was basically about to kick off a 12-month sprint to develop a set of recommendations back to Congress about how to fix wildfire policy. And that was a time-limited, very discrete opportunity to inform a decision-making process that was going to need a whole lot of science and experts. And so we recognized that as an opening policy window, and we're able to quickly spin up. And this is actually the first time we adapted the kind of the Day One format to
Mm-hmm.
a different model. We rapidly stood up a process to quickly bring in science expertise across different aspects of the wildfire problem to go through the memo development process, contribute their ideas to the Wildfire Commission. And as a result, a lot of those ideas ended up in the mix when the commission wrote their final report to Congress. And a lot of the work that's happening now on the ground to think about new wildfire legislation, there's a bill advancing right now that just moved out of the House that's going to the Senate, that we can trace some of the tendrils of the science in that bill back to this initial accelerator. And so it's basically, I think our belief, and just, a note of how I think about the Day One Project, particularly in this moment, is that by democratizing policymaking, we're really advancing the democratic process overall. And so it's an opportunity to ensure that ideas are at the table when they need to be, and in a way that they can be used. And I think over time, I've been thinking about, even, should we do something that's more like an accelerator that's specifically focused on democracy itself? So, like, are there scholars and thinking around, like, what are the actionable ideas about implementing thinking around the science democracy nexus that
Hmm.
should be at the table. And so I think, I mean, that gets a little bit meta, but I think it's I guess coming from this fundamental belief that by democratizing the process and bringing more expert voices into not just the conversation, but actually getting their ideas in front of policymakers, we're breaking down the practice of policy being an elite exercise by the few that kind of know how to work that system. And our hope, I think, is in scaling the Day One project to be able to do that more and better across more different issue areas where it's critical for progress to make sure that that diversity of perspectives are at the table.
Hmm. Excellent. Excellent. Um, Erica, one of the most recent, I guess, Day One projects that was launched is entitled Day One 2025. We just entered the new year, and in this case, you're highlighting uh, five priority areas: emerging tech and AI, global security, government capacity, obviously a hot topic, energy and the environment, and then R&D, innovation, competitiveness. And this has been an extremely important theme for us in recent weeks. We profiled several members of the recently formed Science and Technology Action Committee, talking about not just these technologies, but how we get that next generation interested in STEM, and wanting to do things in STEM. And so I think that's very important that it's on this list of priorities. Talk about 2025. Well, new administration, we all know about that, but take us into the year. What do you hope to accomplish with the Day One 2025 project? And what's coming up that we should know about that we haven't touched on yet that you want to talk about? Please.
So I'll start by saying clearly we're in a very, very difficult time with a lot of uncertainty and a lot of questions about I mean, a lot of questions and a lot of really, really difficult things that we're processing right now in the first week of this administration. I think with Day One 2025, our plan and intent all along was to um, publish a large number of new ideas ahead of the transition, which we did across these domain areas. And now we are, I think, living the walk as policy entrepreneurs and taking stock of the windows and opportunities in a nuanced way around what we've published. And so we're going through an exercise of taking stock of in each of the different domain areas, is this an idea that's likely to have a path forward in this administration? Is this an idea that we need to sort of tuck away on ice for safekeeping? Is this an idea that could advance via coalitions outside of government? Or is its time not right now at all? And so across those different domain areas, um, really carefully looking at all of that and trying to package up a subset of those ideas that we do think are going to be useful in advancing dialogue in the new administration. There's a lot of work, especially in the government capacity memos, where we get into some of the very tactical nuts and bolts of like how government can work efficiently that may be more scalpel than sledgehammer that what we're seeing. But I think that if we get them into some of these conversations that are going on right now, might have receptive audiences because they provide concrete and actionable roadmaps for change. And so, what's next on Day One 2025 is really taking thoughtful stock of this moment and driving progress where we can, holding things in reserve where we can't, pivoting towards, there may be areas where we need to, instead of drive forward, hold accountable. We're having those conversations across our entire team right now, in real time, and moving forward. And I think, that said, policy entrepreneurship is incredibly nuanced. And so I think while there's going to be a lot of things that can't or won't move forward in this administration, I'm inherently more optimistic that there are going to be areas where we can continue to drive progress. And in some of those cases, it may some of these areas around evidence-based decision making, the progress we've made around trying to show, you know, some of that information will be critical in thinking about how we think about government efficiency, making decisions based on the evidence of what's working and what's not working
Mm-hmm.
needs to be at the table, in my opinion, or else those decisions are going to be made without that information. So being able to bring that to bear in this moment is going to be really important. And I think staying in those conversations and continuing to be a resource is going to be really important. So for me, next steps on day one, 2025 is trying to figure out how to support, contribute across our org to having those conversations in ways that we can continue to drive progress and be a resource. And in some cases, that'll look like, avoiding changes in a negative direction.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, definitely a moment of inflection, but really thinking about and driving forward around, I mean, like opportunities to move forward in entrepreneurial, careful, and respectful ways, I think, given the current climate, because it's a pretty complicated time.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. No, you're gonna you're gonna have a busy few years, no doubt. And yeah, no, it's quite interesting times. And I just, again, going back to where we started out, we started with we started with the jellyfish, and we went to Baikal, and we went to the intricacies of policy entrepreneurship, and um, again, the mission of FAS sort of, really hasn't changed much since it was first founded. And a lot of the issues, I guess, that we're, thinking about in 1945, here we are in 2025, and, there's slightly different issues, but nonetheless, we need this rigor. We need science and technology and innovation. And ultimately, we need thought leaders like yourself, helping with policy, creating this next generation of entrepreneurs, bringing the folks in from the wild. So yeah, it's an exciting time, and it's I definitely see the necessity to have this discipline there, and to have more of them. I'd like to be a policy entrepreneur. I have to think more about that, where I can help out. Yeah, no, it's really, really great stuff, Erica. Any final messages while we have you today? Anything I missed while we have you? And then any other public facing initiatives coming up, any conferences, talks that you're going to be giving where we can run into you, meet you? Anything else that you want to mention, please take the floor.
I need to think. No, so I guess I'll just start by saying thank you so much for having me on your show. This has been a great opportunity. I really am intrigued by the fact that you went all the way back to jellyfish and
Love jellyfish.
connected the dots all the way to here. In terms of upcoming public facing events, we don't have anything, I think, huge coming up. We did just have a big day one 2025 summit in December, where we kind of showcased and launched all of the ideas from the initiative. That said, what I will, and this may be something to that we can track on and share, as part of kind of this next phase with the day one community, we, in addition to supporting individual memo authors in defining paths for their ideas, we're also activating the community of authors that have written ideas over time. So now more than 300 strong, bringing in all of our fellows in government, our staff, into a much more coherent and energized day one community. And with that community, we are planning a series of upcoming webinars that we're hoping to bring in some actionable intel about, from the field of, like, what are we actually seeing and hearing around some of the conversations with the transition. I think anticipating one in February that'll focus on OSTP and science policy, exploring another one, a second one probably in March that'll focus on more of some of the government capacity dimensions that we're seeing with the proposed revisions to the U.S. Digital Service. We will keep you all posted on those. We don't have dates on the calendar. We've just started planning for it, but those are some. This upcoming webinar series is one area where we'll have public-facing intersections with the day one community, and kind of some of the thinking that what we're learning from interacting with folks in this time of transition.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent. Excellent. And we will put links in the bio of the show to both FAS, to your profile, as well as day one. So our viewers and listeners can take a look at everything that we've been talking about. Again, really awesome stuff, Erica. Again, for everybody that is going to be listening to this episode of our show across the various podcast networks, or who will be watching on the YouTube channel. Again, you've been spending time with Dr. Erica Goldman, Director of Policy Entrepreneurship and the Day One Program, Federation of American Scientists, doing really amazing things to advance science, technology, innovation policy, ultimately to yield progress. And as we say on our show, create a better tomorrow. Erica, again, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to talk to us for a little while today. Thank you for everything you're up to. And as we like to say, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for all of us via the type of work you're involved in.
Thank you so much.